Silent Hill 2 begins with something that shouldn't exist. A letter from the dead. There's no disbelief, no confusion about this letter, only acceptance. And that's where it becomes unsettling, because the letter doesn't matter. What matters more is why James needs it to be real, not to find her, but to delay what he already knows. James does not experience guilt in a direct, conscious way that can be neatly translated into thought or language. There's no internal sentence that clearly defines what happened. There's no stable moment where the mind fully acknowledges and organizes the event into something that can be emotionally processed. Instead, what exists is something far more unstable, a constant internal pressure that shapes perception without ever becoming fully visible as an idea. It is pre-linguistic guilt, the kind that exists before explanation, before structure, and before the mind is able to safely convert experience into narrative. Because the mind depends on coherence to maintain identity, James' psyche avoids forming complete clarity around the memory, not through deliberate suppression in the traditional sense, but through fragmentation and instability. Certain details remain inaccessible, not because they're erased, but because they cannot be safely integrated. The mind is actively maintaining a version of reality that allows survival, and anything that threatens that stability is either distorted, delayed, or partially excluded from awareness. Silent Hill responds directly to this gap. It does not create guilt or meaning from nothing. It translates internal conflict into external form. You see, when language can't hold experience, perception takes over as the only remaining outlet, and guilt stops being an idea and becomes something felt in the environment itself. The pressure is embedded into the space. Memory is scattered across physical reality. The town isn't interpreting James, it reflects the boundaries of how he can interpret himself. Anything the mind can't consciously subtain is pushed outward and reshaped into the world around him. Silent Hill doesn't really operate the way you may think it does. It's more of a responsive psychological structure, like a system that reorganizes itself based on perception, emotional repression, and internal conflict. You see, what James experiences is not an external reality acting upon him, but more of an internal reality rendered outward in a form that is stable and navigable. The town is not separate from his mind, it is what his mind becomes when forced to externalize unresolved material. Within this structure, physical space loses objective meaning and becomes a representation of psychological function. Fog is not just obscurity, it is a limitation of cognition, restricting how much of reality can be processed at once without collapse. Each area of Silent Hill reflects a different defense configuration of the psyche under strain. Some environments feel stagnant, as if time itself has stopped, representing repression that has been maintained for too long without resolution. Others feel distorted or unstable, reflecting systems of denial beginning to fail. The town does not progress like a conventional narrative setting, it cycles through psychological states, each one revealing a different method the mind uses to avoid confronting what it cannot integrate. What makes this mirror structure unsettling is its neutrality. Silent Hill does not judge James, it does not punish him in a moral sense, it simply responds. It gives form to internal instability without interpretation or commentary. The horror comes from recognition, not of something external, but of the fact that perception itself is the source of what is being experienced. Okay, now I want to talk about Pyramid Head for a little bit, because he does not function as an enemy in the traditional sense of gameplay or narrative. He is not a separate force acting against James with independent motivation or intent. He represents an internal necessity. In psychological terms, Pyramid Head is the embodiment of self-directed judgment that has been displaced outward so it can be experienced without immediate collapse. Because when guilt cannot be consciously processed, it often demands structure, something that gives it shape, repetition, and form, and Pyramid Head fulfills this role. He is not simply a threat, he is a system of enforced acknowledgement. He exists because the psyche requires a mechanism through which unresolved internal conflict can be sustained without being fully confronted at once. The violence associated with Pyramid Head is not random or chaotic. It is structured, repetitive, and ritualistic in nature, suggesting function rather than aggression. It does not behave like combat, it behaves like reinforcement of a rule that has not been yet consciously articulated. James does not simply fear him, there is an implicit recognition that his presence is tied to something necessary within his psychological structure. The pursuit is not just external pressure, it is internal consequence made visible. Maria and Mary represent two fundamentally incompatible forms of memory processing, rather than being two distinct narrative characters. You see, Maria functions as a reconstruction, an idealized version of memory connection that has been stripped away of suffering, contradiction, and deterioration. She is a memory reorganized for emotional survivability, shaped by what the mind can tolerate without destabilization. In her presence, desire is preserved in a simplified form that avoids the weight of reality. And Mary exists as the opposite psychological register. She is not idolized, but burdened with reality, defined by illness, emotional exhaustion, and the slow erosion of stability over time. She cannot be remembered cleanly because full remembrance would require integrating emotional states that are incompatible with the version of self that James is clearly maintaining. As a result, memory does not remain fixed. It shifts depending on the psychological tolerance, creating instability in perception. The tension between Maria and Mary is not a narrative choice, but a cognitive conflict. James is not deciding between two people. He is oscillating between two modes of truth processing. One preserves emotional continuity through distortion, while the other preserves factual continuity through exposure. Neither can fully stabilize without undermining the other, which is why the perception remains fractured throughout the experience. Silent Hill 2 removes the necessity of an external antagonist because the source of conflicts exists entirely within James' psychological structure. There's no invading force, no external corruption, and no independent entity driving the experience forward. Instead, it's just a town. The town reflects the continuation of unresolved internal states that have been expanded until they can no longer be contained within thought alone. At this level, identity itself becomes the mechanism of horror. The self is not undefined or stable, but it's recursive, consistently referencing, evaluating, and reacting to its own unresolved contradictions without external resolution. There is no position outside of awareness from which this process can be observed safely, meaning that escaping is structurally impossible without dissolution of the very system that allows perception to occur. This makes the horror existential rather than physical. It is not about what threatens James, but about the fact that awareness itself is the container of everything he can't escape. Silent Hill is not trapping him. It is revealing that there is nowhere outside of the self for experience to relocate. Silent Hill 2 is not fundamentally about monsters, supernatural events, or mystery-driven narrative structure. These elements exist as externalized translation of internal psychological process that cannot be directly experienced without distortion or fragmentation. The real subject of the game is not what is happening in the town, but how the mind reconstructs reality in order to maintain stability under unresolved emotional contractions. The town functions as a controlled system of psychological exposure. Repression, denial, guilt, and fragmented memory are all given environmental form in ways that allow partial engagement without immediate collapse of identity. Each encounter represents not a progression toward external truth, but a confrontation with internal defense mechanisms that are gradually becoming insignificant to main coherence. The endings therefore do not represent resolution in a conventional narrative sense. Instead, they reflect varying degrees of psychological integration. How much truth can be sustained before identity destabilizes? What changes is not the world itself, but the level of denial that can still be maintained within it. Silent Hill does not resolve the story. It reveals the limits of the mind holding it. Silent Hill does not conclude in the traditional sense of escape or victory. It resolves only in retaliation to how much internal truth can be tolerated without complete psychological breakdown. There is no external exit because there is no external prison. What James ultimately confronts is not a monster, a mystery, or even a memory in isolation. He confronts the final stabilized form of his own perception, stripped of all his mechanisms that previously made it survivable. And in that moment, Silent Hill is no longer something surrounding him. It is what remains when the mind can no longer avoid itself.
I don't know why, but I just love it here. It's so peaceful. It's too bad we have to leave. Please promise you'll take me again, James.